The Rally of Hope. The morning sun stretched its golden rays across the city streets, promising a beautiful day ahead. Jasmine Carter, a 17-year-old high school senior, stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting her Black Lives Matter shirt. The bold, unapologetic letters gleamed in contrast to her rich brown skin. She had picked the shirt carefully, knowing its message was not just about her own identity, but about a movement larger than any individual. "Jasmine, you ready to go?" called her best friend, Tiana, from the hallway. "Almost." Jasmine called back, slipping on her sneakers and grabbing her sign. Equality is not optional. Today was the day of the Black Lives Matter rally at Harmony Park. The gathering had been planned for weeks, and Jasmine had been one of its most enthusiastic organizers. Downstairs, her mother, Monica Carter, was already up, making breakfast. "You sure you want to go, baby? It might get tense," Monica said, her brow furrowed with concern. Jasmine gave her mother a reassuring smile. "I'll be fine, Mom. It's peaceful. We're standing for something that matters. I can't sit back and do nothing." Monica sighed, pulling Jasmine into a hug. "Just stay safe, okay? Call me if anything happens." With that, Jasmine and Tiana headed out, their spirits high despite the weight of their mission. When they arrived at Harmony Park, the sight was breathtaking. Hundreds of people had gathered, young and old, of all races and backgrounds. The air buzzed with unity and determination as people held signs that read "Justice for all" and "No justice, no peace." Jasmine took a deep breath, letting the atmosphere fill her with resolve. She looked over at Tiana. "This is what change looks like," she said. Tiana grinned. "Let's make some noise." As the rally began, Jasmine joined the chant leaders. Her voice rang clear and confident, carrying messages of hope and equality. She saw smiles, heard cheers, and felt the power of unity. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that the world could truly change. But then, a shadow fell over the rally. At the far edge of the park, the hum of engines disrupted the harmony. A line of police vehicles pulled up, their presence intimidating. Jasmine's chest tightened as she saw officers step out, their faces unreadable behind dark sunglasses. At the forefront was Officer Mark Thompson, a tall, broad man with a reputation that preceded him. Tiana whispered, "That's him, Jasmine, the one everyone talks about, the hardliner." Jasmine nodded, her grip tightening on her sign. She had heard stories about Thompson, stories of his rigid, often aggressive enforcement tactics, especially toward Black and marginalized communities. Still, she reminded herself, this was a peaceful protest. They had every right to be there. Officer Thompson scanned the crowd, his gaze stopping on Jasmine's shirt. With a purposeful stride, he made his way toward her, the crowd parting nervously. "Excuse me," Thompson said, his tone cold. "You, with the shirt." Jasmine's heart raced, but she held her ground. "Yes, officer." Thompson crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "That shirt, it's inciting unrest. You need to take it off or leave." The crowd hushed, all eyes on the confrontation. Jasmine could feel Tiana's hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "This is a peaceful protest," Jasmine said, her voice steady. "My shirt isn't hurting anyone." Thompson's expression hardened. "You don't understand the situation, young lady. Remove the shirt, or I'll have to take action." Jasmine's pulse thundered in her ears. Her voice trembled but remained firm. "I have the right to be here. I have the right to wear this shirt. I'm not breaking any laws." The tension in the air thickened as Thompson stepped closer. "I don't want to warn you again," he said, his hand hovering near his belt. Tiana moved to step in, but Jasmine shook her head subtly, signaling her friend to stay back. "This isn't right," Jasmine said, her voice growing stronger. "I'm standing for justice. Why does that threaten you?" The crowd began to murmur, some people pulling out their phones to record the exchange. Jasmine's heart pounded, but she stood tall, refusing to give in. Suddenly, Thompson reached out. grabbing Jasmine's arm. The crowd gasped as he pulled her closer, his grip painfully tight. "You need to comply," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. Jasmine struggled against his hold. "Let me go," she shouted, her voice breaking through the shocked silence. "Hey, let her go," a voice rang out from the crowd. A man stepped forward, his face fierce with determination. "She's done nothing wrong." Thompson released Jasmine's arm, turning to face the man. "This is none of your business," he snapped. "It's everyone's business," the man retorted. "We have a right to protest without being harassed." The crowd began to chant, their voices rising in unison. "Let her go. Let her go." Thompson's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Jasmine feared he might escalate the situation. But then, with a sharp glare, he stepped back. "You're all on thin ice," he barked before retreating to his squad car. The tension began to dissipate as the officers pulled away, but the atmosphere remained charged. Jasmine's arm throbbed where Thompson had grabbed her, but her resolve burned brighter than ever. "Are you okay?" Tiana asked, her voice trembling. Jasmine nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "I'm okay, but this isn't over. Not by a long shot." That night, Jasmine sat at the kitchen table with her mother. Her arm was wrapped in a bandage, and her eyes were heavy with the weight of the day's events. Monica listened as Jasmine recounted the incident, her own face a mix of anger and heartbreak. "You're so brave, Jasmine," Monica said, tears welling up. "But this fight, it's dangerous." Jasmine reached across the table, taking her mother's hand. "It's a fight worth having, Mom. For me. For everyone." As the city slept, Jasmine's phone buzzed with notifications. Videos of the confrontation had gone viral, drawing outrage and support from across the nation. Messages poured in, some filled with encouragement, others with hatred. Jasmine stared at her phone, her heart heavy but determined. The fight was just beginning, and she was ready to stand her ground. Hidden shadows. Jasmine sat in her room late at night, her phone buzzing incessantly with notifications. She scrolled through the flood of messages on social media. Some were supportive, while others dripped with venom and hatred. Videos of Officer Thompson gripping her arm had gone viral, sparking debates and outrage across the city. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Her father, Robert Carter, entered. He was a composed man, always calm under pressure. Tonight, however, his face was lined with concern. "Jasmine," he began, his voice low, "we need to talk." She placed her phone down and looked up at him. "Dad, I know what you're going to say. You're worried, but I'm not stopping. I can't." Robert sat down beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm not asking you to stop, sweetheart. I'm proud of you for standing up for what's right. But there's something you don't know." Jasmine furrowed her brow. "What is it?" Robert sighed heavily, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Officer Thompson works for the same police department I oversee. As chief of operations, I'm responsible for ensuring the integrity of the force. What happened to you today, what he did, is personal for me, not just as your father, but as someone who's supposed to prevent this kind of abuse." Jasmine's jaw dropped. "You oversee the department. Why didn't you tell me before?" "I didn't want you to feel the weight of my position," Robert admitted. "I thought I could make change from within without involving our family. But now it's clear that the issues run deeper than I thought." Jasmine felt a whirlwind of emotions, shock, betrayal, and a flicker of hope. "So, what do we do now?" "We act carefully," Robert said firmly. "Thompson's actions were out of line, but there may be more people within the force who share his mindset. If we're going to fight this, we need evidence, allies, and a solid plan." The following morning, Jasmine joined Robert in his home office. Together, they began combing through documents, complaints, and reports tied to Officer Thompson. What they found was disturbing. Multiple complaints about Thompson's behavior had been filed over the years: excessive force, discriminatory language, and questionable arrests. But each case had been dismissed or quietly buried. "This is a pattern," Robert said, his voice heavy with frustration. "Someone's been protecting him." Jasmine clenched her fists. "How does this keep happening? Why isn't anyone holding him accountable?" Robert looked at his daughter, admiration in his eyes despite the grim situation. "That's what we're going to figure out." As they dug deeper, Robert reached out to Officer Linda Harris, a trusted colleague who had been with the force for over 15 years. She met with him discreetly at a local coffee shop. "I was wondering when you'd reach out," Linda said as she sipped her coffee. "I saw the video. It's disgusting, but not surprising." "Not surprising?" Robert asked, leaning closer. Linda nodded. "Thompson's been getting away with things for years. He's got connections, people who cover for him. I've seen it happen, but every time I try to push back, I hit a wall." Robert frowned. "Why didn't you tell me?" Linda gave him a weary look. "Because even you, Robert, have limits to what you can do in this department. The corruption goes higher than you think." Back at home, Jasmine decided to take matters into her own hands. She reached out to the people who had shared their stories of harassment and discrimination online. Soon, her inbox was flooded with accounts from others who had faced abuse, not just from Thompson, but from a system that seemed designed to protect officers like him. One story stood out: a young man named Caleb, who claimed Thompson had planted evidence during an arrest 3 years ago. His case was dismissed, but the damage to his reputation had already been done. Caleb agreed to meet Jasmine and share his story in person. The meeting took place at a small diner on the outskirts of the city. Caleb, a quiet man in his mid-20s, recounted his experience with a mix of anger and resignation. "I was just walking home from work," Caleb said, his hands gripping his coffee cup. "Next thing I know, Thompson's accusing me of dealing drugs. He pulled a baggie out of his pocket and said it was mine. I spent 2 weeks in jail before they dropped the charges, but it didn't matter. People in my neighborhood still look at me like I'm a criminal." Jasmine's heart broke as she listened. "We're building a case against him," she said. "Your story could help." Caleb hesitated. "You think it'll make a difference?" "It has to," Jasmine said, her voice firm. "We can't let him keep doing this." Meanwhile, Robert's investigation took a dangerous turn. Late one evening, he received an anonymous email with a single attachment: a surveillance photo of him and Linda at the coffee shop. The message read, "Stay in your lane, Carter." Robert felt a chill run down his spine. He knew the risks of digging into corruption, but now it was clear that someone was watching him. He forwarded the message to Linda. "They're trying to intimidate us," he said when they spoke on the phone. "But we can't stop now." "Agreed," Linda said. "But we need to be smart about this. If we go public too soon, they'll bury us." Robert nodded. "We'll gather more evidence, build a coalition. Then we strike." The tension in the Carter household grew as the days went on. Jasmine threw herself into organizing protests and gathering testimonies, while Robert worked behind the scenes to expose the rot within the department. Each step forward felt like a small victory, but the looming threat of retaliation was always present. One evening, as Jasmine was scrolling through her messages, a video popped up in her inbox. It was a clip of Thompson at the rally. But this time, it showed him speaking with another officer before the confrontation. The audio was faint, but one sentence stood out: "We can't let these people think they can take over." Jasmine felt a surge of anger. She forwarded the video to Robert. "Dad, look at this. He's not just acting alone. This is coordinated." Robert watched the video, his expression grim. "This changes everything. We need to find out who he's working with." Jasmine nodded, determination burning in her eyes. "Let's bring them all down." As father and daughter continued their fight for justice, the stakes grew higher. They knew the road ahead would be dangerous, but they also knew that the only way to create real change was to confront the shadows head-on. Breaking the chain. The Carter household was unusually quiet as the weight of their fight settled over them. Jasmine sat cross-legged on the living room floor, a map of the city spread out before her. Red pins marked areas where Officer Thompson's name had surfaced in complaints. It was a grim pattern, a systematic abuse of power that had left scars on their community. "Jasmine, you're burning yourself out," Robert said from the kitchen, where he was brewing another pot of coffee. "I can't stop, Dad," she replied without looking up. "Every pin is a person he hurt. We have to do something." Robert walked over, placing a hand on her shoulder. "And we will, but we have to be strategic. If we move too quickly, they'll shut us down before we even get started." Jasmine nodded reluctantly. She hated the thought of waiting, but she trusted her father's judgment. The next morning, Robert met Linda Harris in the precinct parking lot. They spoke in hushed tones as they leaned against his car, their eyes darting around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I've been digging into old case files," Linda began, handing him a folder. "Thompson wasn't working alone. He's part of a network within the department, a group of officers who cover for each other. They call themselves the Shield." Robert frowned. "Why didn't you tell me?" Linda gave him a weary look. "Because even you, Robert, have limits to what you can do in this department. The corruption goes higher than you think." Back at home, Jasmine decided to take matters into her own hands. She reached out to the people who had shared their stories of harassment and discrimination online. Soon, her inbox was flooded with accounts from others who had faced abuse, not just from Thompson, but from a system that seemed designed to protect officers like him. One story stood out: a young man named Caleb, who claimed Thompson had planted evidence during an arrest 3 years ago. His case was dismissed, but the damage to his reputation had already been done. Caleb agreed to meet Jasmine and share his story in person. The meeting took place at a small diner on the outskirts of the city. Caleb, a quiet man in his mid-20s, recounted his experience with a mix of anger and resignation. "I was just walking home from work," Caleb said, his hands gripping his coffee cup. "Next thing I know, Thompson's accusing me of dealing drugs. He pulled a baggie out of his pocket and said it was mine. I spent 2 weeks in jail before they dropped the charges, but it didn't matter. People in my neighborhood still look at me like I'm a criminal." Jasmine's heart broke as she listened. "We're building a case against him," she said. "Your story could help." Caleb hesitated. "You think it'll make a difference?" "It has to," Jasmine said, her voice firm. "We can't let him keep doing this." Meanwhile, Robert's investigation took a dangerous turn. Late one evening, he received an anonymous email with a single attachment: a surveillance photo of him and Linda at the coffee shop. The message read, "Stay in your lane, Carter." Robert felt a chill run down his spine. He knew the risks of digging into corruption, but now it was clear that someone was watching him. He forwarded the message to Linda. "They're trying to intimidate us," he said when they spoke on the phone. "But we can't stop now." "Agreed," Linda said. "But we need to be smart about this. If we go public too soon, they'll bury us." Robert nodded. "We'll gather more evidence, build a coalition, then we strike." The tension in the Carter household grew as the days went on. Jasmine threw herself into organizing protests and gathering testimonies, while Robert worked behind the scenes to expose the rot within the department. Each step forward felt like a small victory, but the looming threat of retaliation was always present. One evening, as Jasmine was scrolling through her messages, a video popped up in her inbox. It was a clip of Thompson at the rally. But this time, it showed him speaking with another officer before the confrontation. The audio was faint, but one sentence stood out: "We can't let these people think they can take over." Jasmine felt a surge of anger. She forwarded the video to Robert. "Dad, look at this. He's not just acting alone. This is coordinated." Robert watched the video, his expression grim. "This changes everything. We need to find out who he's working with." Jasmine nodded, determination burning in her eyes. "Let's bring them all down." As father and daughter continued their fight for justice, the stakes grew higher. They knew the road ahead would be dangerous, but they also knew that the only way to create real change was to confront the shadows head-on. Breaking the chain. The Carter household was unusually quiet as the weight of their fight settled over them. Jasmine sat cross-legged on the living room floor, a map of the city spread out before her. Red pins marked areas where Officer Thompson's name had surfaced in complaints. It was a grim pattern, a systematic abuse of power that had left scars on their community. "Jasmine, you're burning yourself out," Robert said from the kitchen, where he was brewing another pot of coffee. "I can't stop, Dad," she replied without looking up. "Every pin is a person he hurt. We have to do something." Robert walked over, placing a hand on her shoulder. "And we will, but we have to be strategic. If we move too quickly, they'll shut us down before we even get started." Jasmine nodded reluctantly. She hated the thought of waiting, but she trusted her father's judgment. The next morning, Robert met Linda Harris in the precinct parking lot. They spoke in hushed tones as they leaned against his car, their eyes darting around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I've been digging into old case files," Linda began, handing him a folder. "Thompson wasn't working alone. He's part of a network within the department, a group of officers who cover for each other. They call themselves the Shield." The reckoning. The expose spread like wildfire, igniting protests, debates, and outrage across the city. The morning after its release, Jasmine awoke to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly. Social media platforms were flooded with messages of support, anger, and calls for action. Her name had become synonymous with the fight for justice, but so too had her face become a target. She scrolled through her messages, pausing on one that sent a chill down her spine. "You've gone too far. Back off, or you'll regret it." Jasmine took a shaky breath and looked out her bedroom window. Below, her father was speaking with a group of community leaders in their driveway. She made her way downstairs, finding him in a heated discussion. "We need to focus on the investigation," Robert was saying. "The evidence is solid, but the system won't change itself. We need public pressure." A middle-aged woman, Reverend Patricia Mills, nodded. "The protests are growing. We're planning a march to City Hall tomorrow. But Robert, you need to be careful. The backlash is intensifying." "I know," Robert replied, "but this is bigger than me. It's about accountability and systemic change." Jasmine stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. "I'll speak at the march. People need to see that we're not backing down." Reverend Mills placed a hand on Jasmine's shoulder. "You're brave, young lady. But remember, bravery doesn't mean recklessness. Stay safe." That night, Jasmine sat in the dim glow of her laptop, crafting her speech for the march. Her words flowed from a place of pain and resolve, each sentence a testament to the lives impacted by injustice. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, when her mother entered the room. "Jasmine," Monica said softly, sitting beside her, "are you sure about this? Standing up in front of all those people, knowing the threats." Jasmine turned to her mother, her eyes unwavering. "If I don't, who will? They need to see that we're not afraid." Monica sighed, pulling Jasmine into a hug. "I'm so proud of you. Just promise me you'll be careful." The following day, the march was a sight to behold. Thousands of people filled the streets, their signs held high and their voices united in chants for justice. Jasmine stood at the front of the crowd, flanked by her father and Malik. She felt the weight of their expectations, but also the strength of their support. When it was her turn to speak, Jasmine climbed onto the makeshift stage. She gripped the microphone, her hands trembling. The crowd hushed as she began. "My name is Jasmine Carter," she said, her voice carrying over the sea of faces, "and I stand before you today, not just as a victim, but as a fighter." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "What happened to me isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a system that has failed us for generations. But we are here to say, no more. No more silence. No more fear. No more injustice. The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy electrifying. Jasmine continued, her voice rising with conviction. Change doesn't come easy. It comes with sacrifice, with courage, and with unity. We are stronger together, and we will not stop until justice is served. The applause was deafening as Jasmine stepped back, her heart pounding. Malik gave her a proud smile, and Robert placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did amazing," Robert said. "This is just the beginning." As the march dispersed, Jasmine noticed a figure lingering near the edge of the crowd. It was Officer James Lee. She approached him cautiously, her father by her side. "Officer Lee," Robert greeted him, his tone measured. "Is everything all right?" James nodded, though he looked uneasy. "I've been thinking about what you said, Robert, about doing the right thing." Jasmine stepped closer, and James glanced around nervously before lowering his voice. "There's a meeting tonight. Thompson and the others. The Shield. They're planning their next move. If you want to stop them, this is your chance." "Where?" Robert asked, his tone urgent. James hesitated. "The old warehouse on Pine Street. Midnight. But be careful. They'll be expecting trouble." Later that evening, Robert and Jasmine prepared for the risky operation. They had contacted Carmen Alvarez, the journalist, and shared the tip. Carmen agreed to meet them nearby with a cameraman, ready to document whatever unfolded. "Are you sure about this?" Monica asked, her worry evident as they prepared to leave. "It sounds dangerous." "We'll be careful," Robert assured her, "but we need to see this through." As they arrived at the warehouse, the tension was palpable. Carmen and her cameraman set up discreetly in a parked car across the street, ready to capture footage. Robert and Jasmine waited in the shadows, their hearts pounding. Inside the warehouse, voices echoed. Robert peeked through a crack in the wall, spotting Thompson and a group of officers huddled around a table. Documents and cash were spread out before them. "They're coordinating bribes," Robert whispered to Jasmine, "and probably planning more cover-ups." Suddenly, Thompson's voice cut through the murmur. "We need to deal with this Carter problem. They're getting too close." Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. Robert squeezed her hand, signaling her to stay calm. One of the officers nodded. "We've got people watching him. If he keeps digging, we'll shut him down permanently." Jasmine felt a surge of anger but kept silent. They had the evidence they needed. Robert signaled to Carmen, who began recording through a small window. The sound of a camera shutter broke the silence, and Thompson's head snapped toward the noise. "What was that?" he barked. Robert grabbed Jasmine's hand. "Run." They bolted from their hiding spot as the officers scrambled to investigate. Carmen and her cameraman sped off, their footage secured. Robert and Jasmine darted through the alleyways, their hearts racing. As they reached their car, Robert turned to Jasmine. "Are you okay?" Jasmine nodded, her breath coming in gasps. "We got what we needed." The following morning, Carmen's exposé hit the airwaves, revealing the full scope of the Shield's corruption. The footage from the warehouse was damning, showing officers openly discussing bribes and threats. Public outrage reached a boiling point. Thompson and his allies were suspended pending investigation, and an independent task force was brought in to overhaul the department. The fight was far from over, but the tide was turning. Jasmine and Robert stood together on their porch, watching as neighbors gathered to thank them. "We did it," Jasmine said softly. Robert smiled. "This is just the beginning, but we're on the right path." As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, Jasmine felt a sense of hope she hadn't known in weeks. Together, they had made their voices heard, and together, they would continue to fight. The battle within. The weeks following the warehouse expos brought a whirlwind of activity to the Carter household. Jasmine and Robert found themselves at the center of a rapidly growing movement, their lives transformed by the pursuit of justice. The public outcry forced the city council to act, promising sweeping reforms and independent oversight of the police department. But for every step forward, new challenges loomed. Jasmine sat in her room, her laptop open to a flurry of emails and social media messages. Among the praise and support, there were also threats and hateful comments. She closed the laptop and leaned back, exhaustion pressing on her. The fight was wearing her down, but the fire inside her refused to dim. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. Malik's name appeared. "Hey," she said, answering. "Jasmine." Malik's voice was serious. "We've got a problem. One of the witnesses who came forward is being harassed. Caleb called me. Someone vandalized his car last night and left a note telling him to stay silent." Jasmine's heart sank. "Is he okay?" Shaken, but determined, Malik said. "We need to address this before it gets worse." Jasmine nodded, even though Malik couldn't see her. "Let's meet. We'll figure out a plan." That evening, Jasmine, Malik, and a small group of activists gathered in a church basement. Caleb was there, his hands trembling as he held the crumpled note he had found on his windshield. The words, "Keep your mouth shut," were scrawled in jagged letters. "We need to make this public," Malik said, his voice firm. "If they're targeting witnesses, we can't let them operate in the shadows." "But what if it makes things worse?" Caleb asked, his voice tinged with fear. "What if they come after me again?" Jasmine placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this, Caleb. We'll make sure you're protected." But Malik's right. The more people know about this, the harder it'll be for them to act without consequences. The group decided to hold a press conference, inviting local media to share Caleb's story and expose the tactics being used to silence witnesses. Jasmine would stand alongside him, lending her voice to amplify his courage. The next day, the press conference was held on the steps of City Hall. Jasmine stood beside Caleb, her arm around his shoulders as he shared his story. Cameras flashed, and reporters scribbled notes as Caleb described the threats he had received and the fear he lived with. "These people think they can scare us into silence," Caleb said, his voice trembling but resolute. "But we're stronger than their threats. We won't back down." Jasmine stepped forward, her voice ringing with conviction. "This is exactly why we're fighting. Intimidation, corruption, and abuse have no place in our community. We demand accountability, and we won't stop until we get it." The crowd erupted in applause, but the moment of triumph was short-lived. As the press conference ended, Jasmine noticed a black car idling nearby. Its windows were tinted, and it lingered just long enough to feel menacing before driving away. She turned to Malik. "Did you see that?" He nodded, his jaw tight. "Yeah, we need to be careful." Back at home, Robert was deep in strategy mode. The independent task force had begun its investigation, and he was working closely with Linda Harris to ensure they had access to the right information. But cracks were beginning to show in the department's unity. One evening, Linda arrived at the Carter house, her face pale. "We've got a problem," she said, sitting at the kitchen table with Robert and Jasmine. "Some of the officers implicated in the investigation are trying to undermine the task force. They're spreading rumors, saying the evidence was fabricated." Robert sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Typical. They're trying to discredit the truth." "We can't let them get away with it," Jasmine said. "We need to double down." Linda nodded. "I've been gathering statements from officers who support the reforms. If we can show that there's support for change within the department, it'll weaken their position." Robert leaned forward. "Good. Let's organize a meeting with those officers. We'll need their voices to counter the resistance." The meeting took place in a rented community center, with a mix of current and former officers in attendance. Jasmine sat in the back, listening intently as officers shared their frustrations with the department's culture. "This isn't why I joined," said Officer Ramirez, a young Latina officer who had spoken up during the rally. "I wanted to serve the community, not cover for bad cops." Another officer, a middle-aged black man named Sergeant Jefferson, nodded. "It's been like this for years. You speak out, and suddenly your shifts get worse. Your backup doesn't show up when you need it. It's a toxic system. Robert stood at the front of the room, his voice steady but passionate. Change is coming, but it's not going to happen without people like you stepping up. This is your chance to be on the right side of history. By the end of the night, several officers had agreed to testify before the task force, their courage bolstered by the growing movement for accountability. As the investigation gained traction, so did the backlash. Anonymous threats escalated, and the Carter family found themselves under constant surveillance. One night, a brick was thrown through their living room window, shattering the glass and the fragile sense of safety they had clung to. Monica, shaken but resolute, turned to Robert. "This has to stop. We can't keep living like this." "It will," Robert promised, "but not until we see this through." Despite the mounting pressure, Jasmine refused to be silenced. She continued organizing rallies and speaking at events, her voice growing stronger with each appearance. Her courage inspired others to come forward, and the movement swelled with new energy. One afternoon, as she was preparing for another rally, she received an unexpected visitor. Officer James Lee stood on her doorstep, his expression grim. "We need to talk," he said. Jasmine invited him in, and they sat at the kitchen table. "I've been doing some digging," James said. "There's more going on than we realized. The Shield, they're not just protecting each other. They're tied to local businesses, even politicians. They'd got a whole network." Jasmine's heart sank. "How do we fight that?" James looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. "We hit them where it hurts. Their money." The revelation shifted their strategy. Robert and Jasmine began tracing financial records, uncovering a web of illicit deals and backroom agreements that funded the Shield. Their findings painted a damning picture of systemic corruption that extended far beyond the police department. With this new evidence, they prepared to make their biggest move yet, a public hearing where the task force would present its findings and call for sweeping reforms. It would be a turning point, but it would also be the most dangerous moment in their fight. As the hearing approached, Jasmine stood in her room, looking at the pins on her map. Each one represented a life, a story, a reason to keep going. "We're almost there," she whispered to herself. Almost. The dawn of justice. The city was alive with tension as the day of the public hearing arrived. Outside City Hall, thousands gathered, their signs held high and their voices echoing through the streets. Jasmine stood at the front of the crowd with Malik, Caleb, and her father, her heart pounding in her chest. Today wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about reclaiming justice for her community. "I'm proud of you, Jasmine," Robert said, his hand resting on her shoulder. "No matter what happens today, you've already made a difference." She nodded, her eyes locked on the towering building ahead. "We're not stopping until they hear us." Inside the grand chamber, rows of seats were filled with reporters, activists, community leaders, and police officials. At the front of the room sat the independent task force, flanked by legal experts and investigators. Officer Thompson and several other implicated officers were seated at a table to the side, their expressions ranging from defiant to nervous. Carmen Alvarez, the journalist whose exposé had sparked the investigation, sat near the front, her notebook and recorder at the ready. She gave Jasmine and Robert a nod of encouragement as they took their seats. The chair of the task force, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Eleanor Porter, banged her gavel to call the hearing to order. "We are here to review the findings of the investigation into allegations of corruption, abuse of power, and misconduct within the city's police department." She paused, her steely gaze sweeping over the room. "This is a matter of public trust. The truth will be laid bare today." The first hours of the hearing were a barrage of evidence: financial records, internal emails, and testimonies from officers who had come forward. Jasmine watched as Officer Ramirez and Sergeant Jefferson testified, their voices steady but emotional as they described the toxic culture within the department. "The Shield isn't just a nickname," Ramirez said. "It's a system, a way to protect those who abuse their power and silence those who speak out. When it was James Lee's turn to testify, he took a deep breath before speaking. "I was part of it," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I looked the other way because I was afraid. But what I saw, it was wrong. We owe this community better." The room buzzed with whispers as James detailed the network of bribes, cover-ups, and intimidation tactics. Each revelation painted a clearer picture of the depth of the corruption. As the day wore on, the task force introduced the financial evidence that Robert and Jasmine had uncovered. Charts and graphs displayed the flow of money from local businesses and political donors into slush funds controlled by the Shield. "This isn't just about a few bad officers," Judge Porter said, her voice ringing through the chamber. "This is a systemic failure that has eroded trust and endangered lives." The atmosphere was electric, but Jasmine knew the hearing's most crucial moment was yet to come. She glanced at her father, who gave her a reassuring nod. It was her turn to speak. Jasmine stepped up to the microphone, her palms damp with nervousness. She looked out at the sea of faces, some supportive, some skeptical, and some outright hostile. But she focused on the voices of the crowd outside, their chants faint but unwavering. "My name is Jasmine Carter," she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach, "and I'm here because I refuse to stay silent." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "When I stood at a peaceful rally wearing a shirt that said, 'Black Lives Matter,' I was attacked. Not because I broke any laws, but because I dared to demand justice. What happened to me is part of a pattern that has hurt too many people for too long." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke of Caleb, Ramirez, Jefferson, and the countless others who had come forward. "This isn't just my fight. It's ours. And we're not asking for special treatment. We're demanding accountability. We're demanding fairness. We're demanding a system that works for everyone, not just a privileged few." The room was silent as her words hung in the air. Jasmine met the eyes of Officer Thompson, whose defiance had cracked into something resembling unease. "We deserve better," she finished. "And we won't stop until we get it." Applause erupted, first from the crowd outside as they watched the live broadcast, and then from those in the room. Jasmine stepped back, her heart racing, but her spirit soaring. As the hearing drew to a close, Judge Porter addressed the room. "The evidence presented today is clear and undeniable. This department has failed its community, and those responsible will be held accountable." She turned to the representatives of the City Council. "I recommend immediate action, including the suspension of implicated officers, an overhaul of departmental policies, and the establishment of a civilian oversight board." The council members exchanged nods, their expressions solemn. Change was no longer optional. It was inevitable. Outside City Hall, the crowd erupted into cheers as the news spread. Jasmine and Robert emerged to a hero's welcome, surrounded by supporters and allies. "We did it," Malik said, pulling Jasmine into a hug. "This is just the beginning." Jasmine smiled, tears streaming down her face. "We did it together." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. Officer Thompson and several others were indicted on charges ranging from assault to corruption. The police department underwent a massive restructuring, with new leadership and mandatory training programs aimed at addressing bias and accountability. The community's trust would take time to rebuild, but the seeds of progress had been planted. Jasmine found herself in demand as a speaker, her voice inspiring others to stand up for justice. But she never let the spotlight overshadow the collective effort that had made change possible. One evening, as the family sat together on their porch, Monica looked at Jasmine and Robert with pride. "You both stood up when it mattered most. You made a difference." "We all did," Robert said, his arm around Jasmine. "This is what happens when people come together." Jasmine gazed out at the neighborhood, her heart full of hope. "The fight isn't over, but we've shown that change is possible. And we'll keep going until justice isn't just a word, it's a reality." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city, Jasmine felt a quiet resolve settle within her. They had faced the shadows, and together They had brought the first rays of dawn, the resolution and beyond. The days following the hearing felt surreal for Jasmine. The weight of the battle, the threats, the moments of doubt, it all came rushing back as the news spread. The city buzzed with conversations about the investigation, the reforms, and the voices that had sparked change. For the first time in years, Jasmine saw hope in the eyes of her neighbors. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, the doorbell rang. Robert opened it to find Reverend Patricia Mills standing on the porch with a young boy clutching her hand. Behind her stood Caleb and several other community members, each holding a small candle. "We came to say thank you," Reverend Mills said, her voice filled with warmth. "You've done something incredible for this community." Jasmine and her family stepped outside, overwhelmed by the sight. Dozens of people stood in their yard, each holding a candle. The soft glow illuminated their faces, reflecting gratitude and solidarity. "You gave us our voice back," Caleb said, stepping forward. "You reminded us that we're not powerless." Jasmine wiped away a tear, her heart swelling with emotion. "I didn't do it alone," she said, her voice trembling. "We did this together, and we'll keep fighting together." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers ringing through the night. As the weeks turned into months, the reforms began to take shape. The newly established Civilian Oversight Board, composed of community leaders and activists, became a powerful force for accountability. Robert was invited to help implement changes within the department, ensuring that the lessons learned wouldn't be forgotten. Jasmine continued to speak at events, her story inspiring similar movements in neighboring cities. She worked closely with Malik and other activists to build coalitions that extended beyond their community, addressing broader issues of systemic injustice. One afternoon, Jasmine visited Caleb's neighborhood, where a mural was being painted on the side of a community center. The artwork depicted people of all ages and backgrounds standing together, their faces filled with determination. In the center of the mural was a figure wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt, their fist raised high. "It's beautiful," Jasmine said, her voice filled with awe. "It's our story," Malik said, standing beside her. "And it's just the beginning." Despite the progress, challenges remained. The backlash from some corners of the community was persistent, and there were still those within the police department resistant to change. But Jasmine and her allies had built something stronger than fear, a movement rooted in truth and unity. One evening, as Jasmine sat on her porch watching the sunset, Robert joined her. He handed her a worn notebook, its cover faded from years of use. "What's this?" she asked. "It's your grandfather's journal," Robert said. "He founded the police department with a vision of fairness and integrity. I think he'd be proud of what we're trying to do." Jasmine flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the handwritten entries. They spoke of hope, responsibility, and the belief that a better world was possible. "I think we're getting closer to his dream," Jasmine said softly. Robert nodded. "Closer, but there's still work to do." Jasmine looked out at the neighborhood, the glow of streetlights casting a warm light over the homes. "Then we'll keep going." In the end, Jasmine's fight wasn't just about one officer, one department, or even one city. It was about challenging a system that had failed so many for so long. It was about building something better, not just for herself, but for the generations to come. And as the city slowly healed, Jasmine knew that her voice, once silenced by fear, had become a beacon of hope. Together with her community, she had proven that even in the face of darkness, justice could shine through. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, the path forward felt bright.